Hi, I'm Anna Lenarcik, and welcome to today's episode of Melody of the Future, a series of conversations about how technology is changing the way we create, share, and experience sound and music. Today, my guest is Richard Gillies, a lecturer and researcher in music studies and modern history. His research explores music and identity with a focus on song, voice, and more recently, the development of recording and playback technologies in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. He is currently a lecturer in modern history at the University of Nottingham. This conversation explores how music recording, listening, and distribution have evolved from early analog technologies to today's AI-driven and digital soundscapes. It weaves together historical insight, personal reflection, and critical thought on authenticity, memory, and the cultural meaning of sound in an increasingly mediated world. So, Richard, let's start talking about a little bit of your background, maybe your backstory, and what you are currently up to and with your research.
Sure. So I suppose I'd really describe myself as a musicologist, an academic studying the history of music primarily. I do a bit of history and analysis. But at the moment, I'm actually teaching in modern history. So there's a sort of floating between the two. But my background really is in music and the study of music and musicology. I've been primarily working on classical music or what's sometimes called art music. Started out by doing bits of analysis. I work in particular with songs and poetry, so translating poetry, thinking about how poetry fits to music, how you can analyze poetry and music together when they're linked together in the medium of song. Um, and I also sort of have a background in being trained as a musician too. So as a classical pianist, but then I've also grown up playing in bands. So I've tried to play almost every instrument under the sun. Played a bit of electric bass in bands, guitar, play some banjo, 5-string and tenor banjo.
Oh,
Um, Play the violin. I've even tried learning a bit of the accordion, kind of unsuccessfully recently. But there you go. So yeah, that's my background really, and I've gone into music, studied music history, and these kinds of things.
wow. Can you tell me something more about this banjo music? Because it's not common. I think it's not a common instrument. So why banjo and why? Well,
Well,
where is it
I've
from?
just always, I've had a really, I mean, like I think I was quite lucky when I was being brought up because I had quite a broad exposure to music. I've got older sister, my parents both listening to different kinds of music. So one of the things that I got really quite into was old time music and sort of Kentucky Hills and Appalachian music. Like banjo and fiddle, people playing sort of two finger style or claw hammer and these sorts of banjo techniques. So I just really, really like that stuff and all those old folk tunes. So I just thought, I'll see what I can do with it, get a banjo and try and learn it. And I'm all right. I don't make any pretensions to be particularly any kind of expert at the banjo, but if it brings you joy, I think that's the main thing about playing music, isn't it? I always tell people always come to me and they say, "Oh, I wish I'd learned the piano. I wish I'd learned the violin. I wish I'd done something like this." And I was like, "Well, you can. It doesn't matter if you're no good at it, as long as you enjoy it. That's the main thing. So that's what I'm trying to do with
I
the banjo.
That's cool. So I'm, for example, the boring one. I only play piano,
But
but
that's it. That's all you need.
maybe. But I was, to be honest, I was more interested in this, nerdy stuff like music theory, ear training, and
Hmm.
harmony lessons, and all of that stuff. That was, this finding out why some music piece sounds like it sounds, and
Mm.
why this harmony makes you, I don't know, even feel a different, right? Why
Yeah.
does it sound good or not, and why this arrangement sounds special, and then I also started to dive more, not only from the musical point of view, but also from the scientific, I don't know, acoustics.
Mm.
And I went into sound engineering to
Wow.
also understand it from this angle as well. And yeah, here I am as a sound engineer now, for example. So
Yeah, that's
I
really fun.
think this is the curiosity and finding your general joy, as you said, joy and like field of interest is a very important thing in developing yourself as a human, even, right?
Yeah, of course. I think that's also one of the beautiful things about music. I mean, it's a bit of a cliche to say, but music is a very sociable thing. It brings you together with other people, and that doesn't just have to be you playing with other musicians. As a pianist or whatever, or me as playing a banjo or playing guitar in a band or whatever it might be. I think also the technological aspect of it has to link you to playing with other musicians. When you record or when you do anything that involves the mediation of technology, you have to have a close relationship. So it's like collaborative and creative at the same time. It's not just the musicians putting in their bit and that's the only creative element. And that's always been the case. I mean, it's something that some of my research has just touched on is like very early recording and playback technologies, like wax cylinder and shellac discs. So it's funny to see from where we are now to see where it kind of originated and how these collaborations between like technicians or engineers, studio engineers and stuff have
Mm.
evolved over the last sort of 120 years or so.
Oh, yeah, so this is a very fascinating topic. So let's just dive deeper into this. So, how do you think our relationship to recorded sound has changed, like socially and culturally, since the earliest recordings? And what parallels do you see between that shift and today's, for example, AI
Hmm.
generated music landscape?
I think it's very interesting because there's a point at which when a new technology appears, so this might start off by thinking about the parallels even between when the first recording and playback technologies came out and when, even what we're facing now, a lot of the discussions around AI and it's evolving so quickly and no one really knows, or at least a lot of people like me don't exactly know where it's going. Um, so yeah, I mean, the parallel there, I think, is that when these new technologies come out at first, there's always going to be a point where people go, what's this for? Is it a novelty? Is it something that's going to be used in one way or another way? I mean, so a good example is that at first, when Edison first patented his phonograph and people started making wax cylinders, Edison's opinion was that it would be used for use in an office, basically for voice notes and memoranda and things like that. And so the actual use of that technology then to become primarily for recording music was not his initial intention for it at all. So it's I think that there's also shows you that people who it's a bit simplistic to say one person invents a single technology, but people who sort of pioneer the development of technologies don't necessarily know where those technologies are going to end up and what they're going to end up being used for, basically, right? Um, and then, of course, there's the idea of like reaction to what that is. So some people at first were horrified by the idea of you know an opera singer's voice coming out of a wooden box in the corner of the room. They thought it was strange because it represented this disembodiment of voice and human being. So that's something that I guess we've become slightly more used to. I mean, certainly in terms of recording and listening to recordings, like no one really finds it that weird that you're listening to your favorite band when you're driving along in the car and there's no one there.
Mm.
But at the same time, maybe since COVID as well, even just in terms of communication, like producing things like this online where we're talking to each other across a mediated platform, through online technology, as opposed to sitting in a room together, we're sort of okay with that. And you have to remember that things like the telephone weren't too far apart from the development of the phonograph. So these technologies of sort of communication are always tied in, I think, with technological advances in terms of recording culture. And they even used to have, there was, I can't remember now off the top of my head where I read this. It's a really good book by a good scholar, and I've forgotten everything about the details. But they're looking into things like in one of the Paris World Fairs, late 19th century, of having, I'm holding my hand here because of having telephone concerts where you could pick up a telephone and hear music that was being performed in a concert hall, like down the way. So that was before these recording technologies, but there's sort of these early experiments with the way that sound and that can be transferred in a certain direction. So yeah, it's fascinating, and I think really the parallels here are strongest in terms of what we're going to be doing with this AI. Like what's going to happen to it? How's it going to evolve? How's it going to affect recording, distribution, all these kinds of things?
Could also maybe explain it more, where it started from, and through like most important points in
Mhm.
the history. like maybe some events, like particular devices, some inventions,
Yeah.
crucial inventions. Mm-hmm.
So the first real way of recording, I think that when the first thing that got marketed in terms of when people were recording music and well before that just voice was the wax cylinder. Really is the earliest major sort of thing that gets distributed, and that's interesting because wax cylinders, they're produced. They are literally a cylinder that is rotating, and you have a diaphragm that you sing or speak or play into, and then the sound waves go into that and scratch onto the wax via a needle, the vibrations, and then that is your finished product once you've done that, and that plays back in that way. So it's an interesting thing because you can only do a single take on it. You also can't reproduce it. If you want to reproduce, if you're a singer and you want to produce 10 versions of the same song, you have to sing that 10 times, in as similar a way as possible if you want to distribute it in that way. And the other thing is interesting about the medium is that it's distorting. So wax is a distorting medium. So for example, if you have a particularly fast or wide vibrato, it will sound different on wax than it sounds in real life. So a little interesting point about the intersection between that technology and modern technology, there have been some attempts to digitize and digitally clean up, as it were,
Mm-hmm.
which I put in scare quotes, clean up and make it digitally clean, wax cylinders of, say, for example, Caruso singing. And this is marketed with the idea of saying, this is Caruso's real voice, how Caruso would have been, how he would have sounded in the concert hall. But this is obviously a complete lie, or not a lie, but, a fallacy, because the wax is a distorting medium and it will always sound distorting. So when you digitize and digitally clean a wax cylinder of Caruso singing, you don't actually create what Caruso would have sounded like. All you're creating is a completely, entirely different new product, which is a digitally cleaned version of a wax cylinder, which nobody at the time would ever have heard. Yeah. So that's an interesting point there, because the cylinders don't decay. Well, they do decay, but they sound imperfect even from the first time you record them. So no one would have ever heard Caruso like that, So that's an interesting interplay, perhaps, between those,
Oh yeah.
present and past technologies. And then after that, you had various people like Berliner who was working on uh, cylinders, discs rather than cylinders. Yeah. And the advantage of the discs is that you can the first recording is done in a similar way, singing into this diaphragm that then cuts it into a wax disc this time. The advantage of the discs, the wax discs, is they can act like masters. So that's where the idea of the master disc comes from. And then from the master disc, you can imprint in shellac several different, pressings of it. So it makes it more mass marketable, basically. So that's that's the next step onto being able to distribute these things to a much wider audience and much more
Mhm.
efficiently, and presumably make more money off it, basically, as well. So I think those are the two major sort of leaps in the early recording field that are important. So then basically just after that those two main developments, I suppose, being the cylinder and the disc, then it eventually goes on further into stuff that's less of my field of knowledge, but into tape, magnetic tape, reel to reel, and things like that, and then into obviously CDs, and then eventually, like with the MP3s, making a massive difference in terms of how music is started distributed and becomes so much less about physical material. So yeah.
Okay, I also want to ask you about this like embodiment issue for people who just started to get familiar with the technology in the past, right?
Mm.
So, have you studied like more like, let's say, psychological point of view, this connection, like their experiences with sound from some device, right?
Hmm.
Can you just also describe it more, like that, because you said that people were surprised and they even were scared about this, right? Like for now, like for us, it's like so common, it's like not even natural,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it's funny because it's just that's one of even quite a few reactions. I think that in fact, probably the very first reaction to it, there's a famous recording of having a few people standing around, including Tchaikovsky, talking about, oh, listen, look, it's recording our voices and things like that. So I think actually one of the first reactions to it was even a bit. Um, viewing it almost as a kind of novelty or something that's like, oh wow, what does this thing do? This is some new sort of toy that we have here. But I think it was really a reaction against when people started recording and distributing and making, actually using it. This is years later. Tchaikovsky died in 1893, so this is the very early time of it. But later on, after 1900, um, when the distribution of cylinders and then later on discs became more prevalent and it became a way of consuming music, I think that's when some of the responses to it, that were both in a way, like you say, in terms of this sort of strange sort of disconnect between body and voice, but also there were reactions to it which were, I suppose you could count them in terms of taste. Yeah. So there was, I don't know if this is the case everywhere, in all different countries, but there were objections to it as being something that was actually a sort of, middle class, upper middle class, tasteless thing to do. So in the Associated Press, there were jokes about, things like, well, did you hear that they're selling phonograph players cheap down the market? And the response is, thanks, but I only like to burn real birch wood in my stove. And all these things about how it's a sort of cheap mode of entertainment, or all gramophones are worth for is to chop them up and use them for firewood, or they're not even worth that. Um, so there was a big range of reactions to it, So the idea of people saying this is completely unnatural, this disembodied voice coming out of a box in the corner of my room, that's one reaction to it. And then obviously there are other reactions just saying, oh, well, this is just a kind of tasteless thing. And I don't know, but I wonder, something I'd be interested in researching and looking further into is if this is almost sort of played out in a kind of class hierarchical way, in the sense that, real art, live art, it's consumed by a certain particular class. And you could say, oh well, making, in one way you could say that the recording and playback technologies democratize that kind of musical art. So then one other defense mechanism is to say, oh well, it's not actually real. This is nothing compared to hearing the real singer sing on the operatic stage or whatever. This is why it's so fascinating, because there's so many angles you can choose to look at it from. Because then you can also say, well, what about the actual singers themselves, or what about the composers themselves? Who comes first on the label, and what rights do they get, and things like that. So yeah. But the disembodiment thing is a very interesting response. I would say that there are some. I think it's tied to taste more than it seems to me anyway. That it's tied to taste more than it is to just sort of a fear response to some technology. Because, like I mentioned slightly earlier, this is developing sort of at a similar time, just slightly later to the telephone. So people have probably grown slightly used to the idea of a disembodied voice with a telephone, but maybe it's it's something that has its own sort of response, because people view music as this kind of social thing. And I think that's one of the things about the technology that's changed a lot. One of the things that gets discussed a fair bit in terms of the psychology of recordings and listening and music and consumption of music is headphones. So it's sort of, if you extract yourself from what that actual activity is, it's if you think of music as a sociable thing where people come together to make music, like we first started talking about, and then you change the consumption of that music into just you being in your own world with your headphones, like noise cancelling headphones. It's a completely changes the way we interact with music. It's evolved to in a very different extent. And maybe the similar, maybe the argument started when people said, oh well, now I can listen to Caruso in my living room without having to go to see him in a concert hall. So yeah.
Yeah, but generally speaking, I think this is still a case that whatever some new way of experiencing, even like, let's stick to the sound and music, right? But there are many different ways. Like, for example, this immersive environment, right? And when there are digital concerts, and still people still crave to go to see some artists live, and there is still ongoing discussion that it's somehow irreplaceable.
And I think I just went for a drink with a friend of mine after work, and the place where we were playing, there was just someone playing the guitar and singing, and we were sitting outside, but because it's in the summer, it was nice and sunny out, but he was saying, even like just hearing through the door or through the window, or whatever, you can just tell instantly that something is being performed live, and it creates a completely different atmosphere, rather than being in a pub where there's music on in the background and it's something that's a recording that's being played. So it does make this difference. I wonder if there are parallels from the early days of recording technologies. Will this replace somehow human connection, or will this replace the
Mm-hmm.
will to see live music? But of course it doesn't, because it's something that doesn't replace it, but it makes up for it if you can't access it in a different way, perhaps. you know
Mm-hmm.
there's still this need to experience music as a sort of sociable thing in a way. And that was interesting over the pandemic as well, because there were loads of ensembles and bands who did like Zoom concerts
Mm-hmm.
or whatever, online concerts, some of which were, say, filmed and then broadcast online, like including orchestras, filming stuff, like sitting around in a concert hall
Yeah.
socially distanced and broadcasting it live. But also the example of people doing ensemble work by trying to synchronize everything and
Mm-hmm.
putting the ensembles together, which created this kind of well, it was an attempt, I suppose, to it was a digitally mediated or technologically mediated way of recreating liveness when you couldn't have live events. I think it's not about replacing the live music, but
Mm-hmm.
it was at least a way of coping with a certain situation where something else was unavailable. And the other thing is, I think, if we think of it in terms of access, perhaps as well, there are also the development of these technologies in this way can probably help people who can't access these things
Mm-hmm.
for whatever
Oh
reason
yeah.
that might be, for health reasons or whatever else, health or economic or environmental, whatever. So there's a positive side to it, which helps to connect people who don't have access to certain things either.
Yeah,
Um,
indeed. So I had a chance to meet people who work in the foundation. That they made this action to go to places where old people live, and
yeah,
they brought them VR headsets with recordings, like immersive recordings of concert of their favorite artists. Like they were like all like from, I don't know, maybe 50s, 60s, these artists.
yeah,
And that was during some music therapy conference I had the chance to attend, and they were presenting the whole idea and the impact of this. And I just thought that this is such a lovely way to bring these people joy, that some of them, they even cannot walk, or they just they are just bored for the whole day, and then um, enable them to having this experience. Like they filmed also their reaction after this concert,
mm,
and they were like, oh my gosh, they were so amazed of being able to somehow teleport to to this
yeah.
experience in virtual reality, right? So
And
this
it
is
allows this kind of mode of participation that's sort of blocked off from certain people, for whatever reason it might be. And it's interesting, like you say, it's about it's useful as a kind of therapy, because it provides you with this sort of sociability that you might not have access. I mean, when you were saying that, what came into my head is some of the work that's been done. Again, this isn't really my specialist field, but I've read about some of the work being done with Alzheimer's and music, and working with
Mhm.
old people who might be suffering from Alzheimer's, and using music and various technologies. I mean, in particular music and sort of with headphones to help stimulate and open up the part of the brain that overrides their experience of Alzheimer's or dementia. These ideas of the connections between psychology, or whether it might be the breaking down of like the mind in a way through dementia, and the way that music can sort of stimulate things that were thought lost, stimulate certain memories. It's a really fascinating field of research that I'd love to know more about.
I can't wait for this field of research to be more developed. I think it's still we still have not enough data and confirmed
Hmm.
research into how music and sound impact our brain. But from neuroscientific point of view, I think it's fascinating that there are also people who have dementia and they can play pieces they learned by heart. They have this muscle
Hmm.
memory, and it's still there, even they have like already advanced stage of Alzheimer, for example. So this is very
Yeah,
fascinating, and maybe this
that
is
is
also the clue
fascinating.
to find a cure for this
Well,
thing.
there's also, I mean, the fact that there's this obvious link between, if you've learned an instrument, if whether it's classical music and you've learned to piano pieces off by heart, or
Mm.
even if it's stuff that you've written yourself, or you've played in bands and things, you always have that muscle memory of like chord progressions and various different things. So there's this strong link that it's not only mental, obviously, it's also sort of tactile. It's something
Mm.
that stimulates it's motor skills at the same time as
Yeah.
it's conceptual. I've thought about this in some of my research, in that there's some, this maybe is going slightly off topic, but it touched on the idea of music and memory, which I think is interesting when we're talking about dementia or Alzheimer's, and the idea of memory and
Mhm.
stimulating something that might have gone. So I've done some research on Silvestrov, the composer, who's still living, and he was born in the 1937. But a lot of his music is to do with well, it stimulates kind of memory of an echo of music past, right? So there's a famous suite of piano pieces that he wrote in 1977 called Kitsch Music, and the second movement of that takes a melody from a fellow composer of his called Miroslav Skorik. But he uses that melody, but underneath he puts the chords from Chopin uh, uh, Prelude Number 4 in E minor,
Mhm.
the descending chords that descend chromatically. Now, obviously, if you've ever played the piano or learnt the piano,
Yeah, this is
most
the.
classical students will have learnt that piece. It might be the
Mhm.
first piece of Chopin they learnt.
Yep,
It's the first piece of Chopin I ever learnt when I learned the
I
piano.
confirmed.
And yeah, so it's something that's really well known, and it's especially if you've learnt the piano, even if you haven't, you've probably heard it in some form or other. But it's the way he puts the chords in D minor. It's in compound time. It's not it's not in 4/4, or whatever the original is in. It's in a different time signature. So and then it has this melody from Miroslav Skorik on the top. So it's sort of, it's familiar but unfamiliar, and it's interesting when you hear it because it stimulates some kind of memory like an echo, but you might not immediately place what it is because it's slightly uncanny. But then when you think about those chords, one of the things that comes to mind if you've learnt the piano is you have this tactile
Mm.
physical sensation if you learnt those chords. So it's not only an oral perception, it's also a sort of physical perception of the music at the same time. So maybe there's something in there, when we're
Mm.
talking about the way that music can help stimulate and revive certain thought processes, or people with dementia can still play
Yeah.
with the muscle memory. It has this very powerful dual operation. That's not just one or the other.
Oh yeah, and also like you can literally change your mood depending on what you listen and what you
Yeah,
how you perceive like specific kind of music. Like for example, if you like some music piece and you have some nostalgia from maybe some early years or some nice memory with it, it can have a huge impact into your feelings, moods, like
yeah.
state of mind, right?
But even something as simple as going back and thinking, you just maybe chatting with some friends about bands you used to listen to when you were 12 years old or 15 years old or whatever, and someone mentions a band and just thinking, oh, I haven't thought about that band for ages, for years and years. If you go back and then you stick on a record that you used to listen to sort of when you were like I say 12 or 15 or something, it does unlock certain memories and it makes you feel certain ways, and it's sort of it's different. It doesn't just make you feel as you felt when you were listening to it the first time, but it maybe sort of stimulates some kind of memories, and it makes you feel like, oh, I remember this.
Oh yeah, and funny thing because, for example, there are some songs that I would say from, I don't know, like they are not very high quality, or there are some crappy that is very basic, but I remember them from my childhood. For example, even I know that I wouldn't probably like them now if they would have the premiere now, but because I remember I've been listening to the radio as I was a little girl, and I remember, for example, summertime with this music in the background.
Mm.
And even though it's like not my favorite kind of music, but in the same time, it brings me nice memories, right? So this
Yeah,
is
absolutely.
so my guilty
Yeah.
pleasure, I would say.
I think so. And I don't want to keep on going back to Silvestrov, but actually just reminded me that he spoke in an interview that he was doing about maybe 15 years ago or something. He was talking about, because I mentioned this set of piano pieces called kitsch music, and kitsch is often
Oh.
used as a sort of it's often used as an insult, after Clement Greenberg and kitsch versus the avant-garde, or avant-garde
Mm.
versus kitsch. The idea that it's sort of something that's sort of populist, but not very good quality, something that just people like, nice
Mm.
melody, and Greenberg made this incredibly elitist argument that, you know, we need kitsch in order to essentially keep the populace happy, so that we can have avant-gardism
Oh
and do
my
experimental intellectual stuff. So there's obviously that very sort of intellectual elitist argument against kitsch. But Silvestrov's idea was to reclaim it and say that actually kitsch is this very meaningful and elegiac thing, you know. So there's a footnote at the beginning of kitsch music where he says the composer regards the term kitsch as elegiac, not ironic. Yeah,
God.
which,
I,
you know, it's a bit secretive, but you can tell what he's getting at. But he mentions Robert Musil, the writer, and he gives this example of these soldiers in a trench before they have to go over the top, and they're singing a popular tune from back home. And that tune itself, from an elitist point of view, might just be kitsch. It might be nothing interesting. The melody might be very simple. The chords might be simple. It might just be cheesy. It might be rubbish, whatever you think. Have no like intellectual or artistic value from a sort of elitist perspective. But to those soldiers at that moment, it means everything, because it means everything that they came from, everything about their lives, all the bonds that they share. And so at that moment, it has an intense emotional and psychological value, even if you could say technically, oh, it's just kitsch, you know.
mm,
So, you know, like when you hear these things, you might not, it might just be some tune from the radio, some pop song that you heard, you know, years ago when you were a little kid. And, you know, if you were to hear it now, you think, oh, that's really naff, or that's really cheesy, that's rubbish. But because it has this association, it's actually not, you know, for your
yeah,
own personal and subjective response. It's an important emotional and psychological experience, really, that, you know, works with memory.
indeed. Indeed, I'm very far away from even dividing this, elite music from kitchen music. Of course, you have to have your own preferences, and the putting input into the quality, I think it's important. But in the same time, there are many purposes why music is made, and I think it should more like bring people together than make these divisions. So, but this is my
Yeah, I
my
completely
personal
agree.
statement.
Yeah, I completely agree. You know, the boundary between these ideas of sort of, you know, intellectual or avant-garde music and popular or kitsch music is, you know, they're artificially creative. They're sort of like discursively creative terms. They don't really reflect human experience of music. I think that we've come a long way from that. You know, there's still problems with terms like, you know, in English, do you call it art music to distinguish it from popular music? But then would you say that, just to take the most obvious example off the top of my head, would you say that some of the Beatles records don't
Mm.
count as art? Or whatever, whoever else it might be. Of course, you know, all of these records count as art, but so there's still a sort of divide in the language, even though I think people are trying to get rid of this sense that there should be a separation. I think it's something that really reached a massive height in the mid 20th century. You know, it's like a sort of post-war or interwar
Mhm.
and post-war mid-century thing that's like this idea of elitism as a good thing, you know, not as a bad thing. But yeah.
Coming back to this differences between live acts and recordings,
Mm.
like in terms of listening, right? And what do you think about this club culture? Because DJing is something in between, because you play already like ready tracks, recorded tracks, and there's
Yeah.
a big culture around this. So it's also like they even call it like DJ live act with some even live instruments, but also like DJ said, it's something that presents live but recorded music. So this is also very interesting in terms of thinking about this as, is it live experience? Is it like how we perceive it?
Yeah, I mean that is very interesting. I see. I mean there is an element of connection between the two things, but I think that this idea of liveness is still very much encapsulated in like the club scene and club culture, because it's not the same of just going to, say, a bar that's got a dance floor where there is just a soundtrack on. Yeah, someone
Mhm.
just like stick on a playlist on shuffle. People might still get up and dance to that, but when you have somebody who's actually mediating the sound that you're hearing, you know, someone who's actually working with it, mixing it, and
Mhm.
and you know, kind of creating it, almost improvising with it as they go, that's
Yeah.
that's a level of skill which is, you know, if you reduce the piano to essentially a machine with buttons that you press, then
Mhm.
it's there's a kind of a kinship between those two skills. You know, you're listening to process, and you're mixing, and you're just doing stuff as you go along. You
Mhm.
know,
Yeah.
so I think in that sense, when you come and see, whoever you might be talking about, various like electronic or like whatever nights you go to, like psytrance nights, was a big thing. I went to university in Bristol. There was a big psytrance culture there, for example, and psytrance and like trip hop and that kind of stuff, which
Oh.
always blended elements. Like Portishead, for example,
Mm.
blend elements of sort of like sampled music and like DJing and stuff like that with live music as well, with like guitarists and stuff, so and live singer. So there's these kinds of crossovers that I think are really interesting. The other thing that came to mind as well is that a bit of history that I heard it recently with a kind of colleague or fellow academic of mine that was talking at a conference. He was talking about Latvia and the way that recording, DJ culture was coming in there, because there was before the kind of turntables, like the belt drive
Mhm.
turntables that were more expensive, and a lot of this technology had come into the west of Europe from the United States. There was this culture of tape jockeys. So people were using reel to reel tapes in the same way that DJs were using
Oh,
records, to mix and to kind of blend and to
tapes.
scratch, not scratch obviously, but creating something that was akin to, like skipping the record to sort of mix the beats and things. They were doing it with reel to reel tapes, and it was only through like artistic exchange programs that say
Oh, wow.
DJs from the West started visiting in the 80s and bringing these things and donating technologies, and then they started experimenting with these new technologies. So it's amazing that they were familiar with the stylistics of the music and they were influenced by it, but they didn't have technologies. So they were using the available technology to create something. It's such an amazing sort of idea about kind of exchange between like
Mhm.
musical stylistics and also technologies that mediate those stylistics.
Oh, yeah, that's
Um,
amazing how, this is the pure creativity then, right?
yeah, yeah,
Mm.
exactly. Yeah.
But coming back to your field of expertise, because you've studied early sound archives, right? So do you think we are doing enough to archive today's like rapidly evolving digital and AI-based music practices? So what do you think? What will be missing from the historical record?
There are efforts to digitize the physical holdings, for example. That's something that is ongoing. It's something I think that a lot of places haven't really done yet or are in the process of doing. I guess that really, I suppose it reflects the status of these objects as objects of material and historical curiosity now. They're also objects that sort of safeguard cultural heritage. There's like whole song traditions and things, and especially if you're thinking about language, for example, there are songs in the languages of the countries, the popular songs that are preserved there and have been recorded in like 1902, 1905, 1910, which are now being kind of digitized. I think there's a resurgence of interest in those kinds of cultural heritages of sound, which is quite interesting. But I wonder as well, I don't know, it's difficult because there's a big difference between thinking about how we safeguard or archive cultural practices when the base thing is not physical media, if you know what I mean.
Mm, mm,
So a lot of these discs and like wax cylinders and shellac discs, they ended up in archives, they ended up in museums, or they ended up in personal archives because someone was a big collector of them and then they might have passed away and donated them to a particular museum. They are traditional archival objects in a sense because they're a physical thing that's held there, that's held in a place that's supposed to protect them. Whereas if you start with a digital format, I think people maybe struggle to conceptualize how archiving that or safeguarding that as cultural heritage works when it's kind of immaterial to a
mm.
certain extent.
When I think about, for example, digitalizing old recordings, it's very difficult to even recreate the sound. It's probably impossible, even like one to one, right? Like when I, for example, work with sound, and there are these filters that you can put on some recording to make it sound like from the past or from
Mm.
some special device, like from tape or from vinyl or even from the cylinder, right? And but you can tell that there is this filter, but also it's you, I don't know, maybe it's some placebo effect that if it's
Yeah,
it's from digital.
maybe this is sort of what I was thinking about when I was thinking about this material difference between something that's actually got a physical tactile quality to it and something that is
Mhm.
digitized or comes from a digital world. I mean, the thing that came to mind when you were just mentioning that and the idea of like working with sound and applying certain filters that sort of create the sense of something being old is that we have these kinds of tools at our disposal now and are interested. We're in a sort of situation where we've got so much exposure and possibility to different technologies and sounds of the past at our fingertips that we can always hear. The trajectory from the early days of recording has always been upwards towards trying to produce higher fidelity.
Mm.
So the idea that the scratchiness on a wax cylinder, the imperfection of the wax cylinder, or the scratchiness of a shellac disc, or whatever it might be, in the way that they degrade, is an imperfection, and it's like it's good, but it's not as good as actually hearing something in high fidelity. So then the further you go on, the technology develops to getting higher and higher and higher fidelity, and you keep on seeing reissues and remasters of like the classic
Mm.
albums from the 60s and 70s now, remastered edition, expanded edition. Then the idea then that you could have a filter that creates a lower fidelity sound, as it suggests that this has become an aesthetic.
Oh
you
yeah.
know so the technological limitation is an aesthetic more than it is just a technological limitation, if you like. you know
Oh yeah,
there's
and it's very
something
popular
people
even.
talk about.
Mhm.
Exactly. I've heard people talk about like the warmth of tape, and the idea that recording reel to reel and magnetic tape gives it this kind of warmth. And when I've played in bands, in fact, we've done some recording where we have recorded using a mixture of analog and digital recording process. I'm no sound engineer, but to essentially have a digital object that you can mix and master easier than you would with a tape, obviously, but to have some sort of sound quality underneath it that
Mhm.
would produce this, warm, as is the term I often hear being used, but warm tape sound.
Yeah.
So there's something people, I'm sure there's, I don't know whether it's a kind of weird nostalgia, or whatever else it might be. It's funny because it's a nostalgia that people now, who are born in the 90s and even born in the 2000s and after, people who have, it's a sort of fake nostalgia or an impossible nostalgia for something that was never part of their lives or even our lives. So I remember having tapes growing up, like
Mhm.
that was about as far back as it went. I wasn't growing up buying vinyls when I was a kid. I was did buy tapes and so on in the early days, but there's this sense. I mean, there's a good word in, like in Welsh, there's the word hiraeth, which is this idea of, it's like a nostalgia, but it's got more to it than nostalgia. And it can
Mm.
also it can be a sort of nostalgia for a place or a concept or some kind of home or some sort of imagined home, as well as it is anything real. So I wonder if there's this sort of sense of like comfort and sort of nostalgia, like audio nostalgia,
Oh yeah.
for these, for an imperfect sort of sound. People often, I've heard a lot of people talking about the idea that when you hear something as a perfect performance and a perfect recording, so there's something that can be very sterile about them. And the
Mhm.
question is, what's the music actually trying to communicate here? So if you go into a studio and you play every single note correctly and you have every single dynamic marking, or uh, you know
Mhm.
accelerando or ritardando or whatever else it might be, you have that all perfect. It becomes kind of mechanical and it becomes sterile in some respects. I mean, this is personal taste. Lots of people like that sound, and that's completely fine. I've always enjoyed, like when you have pianists who record live, and they might be kind of almost a scrappy performance, but
Yeah.
there's some sort of musicality in there. The imperfection creates this something that's very enjoyable about it, a kind of excitement about it. So maybe
Yeah.
in audio technological terms, getting back to the imperfection is a similar sort of experience. Worldly almost, like and it makes the music sound more sort of,
Mm.
I don't know, it makes it sound different.
It's like a reverse approach, right? Because in early recordings, like technical limitations shaped aesthetic choices, right? And now this limitless fidelity is available, right? And yet lo-fi, like degraded textures, like are often embraced. So, what does this say about how we define truth in sound today?
Hmm. That's an interesting question. Like the idea of fidelity, I mean, the word fidelity comes from the word for truth or faithfulness, right? So,
Mm.
or trueness to something is some sort of faithful adherence to something, I suppose. I mean, I've thought about this a lot, and you often see the word in student essays, authentic. This is more authentic, which is really
Mhm.
interesting because it's often the way that people envisage what music they're listening to, or whether they think it's good or whether they think it's authentic. But the question is always authentic to what? And the idea of authenticity in music is such a thorny, slippery, issue. I'm usually just like, don't go there, because whatever's authentic is it's elusive. It's a mystery. It
Mhm.
often comes up when people are talking about um, like folk music and stylizations of folk melodies, as if folk is something that's
Mhm.
unchanging and unchangeable, doesn't evolve, and it's got this mystical, frozen sort of status. But actually, that's obviously just nonsense. So where is the idea of authentic? What is sort of true or what is authentic in terms of sound is really, really fascinating to me. And I think when you're recording, you're working towards a sound that you think maybe it's what you think is authentic to what you aim for as a live performance. I'm sure. I mean, different artists go about it different ways. I think that there is one school of thought that is you want to try and recreate the liveness in your studio recordings, right? And that has to be driven by some idea of like fidelity or to liveness, if you want to use that term. It's a strange one because the process is mediated through editing and technological tinkering
Mhm.
about with stuff. Um, and then there's also a whole sort of separate genre, I suppose, of live recordings, whether that in popular and classical music worlds. So there are certain pianists like Richter, for example, who hated recording in studios and basically only recorded live his entire life. So most of his recording output is recorded live. There's a lower fidelity there in the sense that some of the recordings are sort of a bit, the microphone placement's not great and you don't hear all the details. The acoustic might not be particularly good. It hasn't, depending on where it's recorded and how much effort they put into the setup. There is a fidelity there to liveness. He captures, you hear him playing in such a way that he's, hitting wrong notes here and there, and they're obvious. That it's completely imperfect in that sense. But there's, I suppose, a kind of truth to a live performance there that's not hiding behind um, editing in the studio, for example. But even when I say hiding behind, that suggests a kind of qualitative judgment. For me, it would be hiding behind.
Right?
Yeah,
It's like the artistic choice, right? And if it's true for audience, it depends on the also like subjective opinion, I would
yeah,
say. Yeah.
definitely. And we also, there's a lot of feedback between performer and audience in the days in which we live. That then produces its own discussion, and even what we're talking about now is sort of part of that discussion because, like I say, he didn't hide behind studio process, but it's like I'm not saying that people who did do net. I'm not also not saying that everybody should just record uh, completely live and you don't get a chance to edit and do something because in itself it's a really interesting process. Take a piece of music, I'm just talking about say like classical music.
Mhm.
The idea of fidelity as well can also be between not just in terms of liveness or performance, but it can also be to the notes on the page as well. So you can have, you could say, all right, I want to create a recording here that sounds exactly what's written on the page. For whatever reason you want to do that, there's a whole other realm of like musicological debate about Verktreu, this idea of fidelity to the piece, and this kind of philosophy that emerged in the 19th century. You have to do what exactly the composer's word is final, and you must do that. Which I won't go into that. That's a separate topic. But you could do that, and that would still be a valid, artistic choice or experiment. You say, I would like to hear what would it sound like if we did play it in this way, and maybe you like it, and that's great, and that's completely fine. I've just recently been recording a load of stuff well, not well, but because I've just been at the moment just recording it on my phone. For example, I was just improvising at the piano at night in the dark. Turn the lights off, so it creates a world where you're listening more and feeling more than
Mhm.
thinking. So like improvising, um, and just recording it with my phone on the side. And I thought, with a view to eventually, I'd like to record these properly, like get a mic set up and
Mhm.
sort of mix them properly and stuff like that. And then I go through the process of thinking like, well, actually, one of the things that makes these recordings on my phone so good is the extraordinarily, well, at least to me, I mean, so good, why I like them rather is what I'm saying, is because it's got an incredibly low quality to it. I'm also using the practice pedal on the piano. It's an upright piano, so it's not a
Mhm.
soft pedal, but the practice pedal. So it shifts this big layer of felt down in front of the strings. So it creates all these strange overtones. It's really muffled. And the fact that the recording quality on the phone is so low, it really somehow captures the atmosphere in that dark room. Or when I listen to them back, I feel like, from my experience, it captures the atmosphere in which I made them, and the imperfections, getting some wrong notes here and there because I'm just improvising. And I think, actually, I wonder, it might be an interesting experiment to then actually try and maybe even transcribe some of those improvisations and record them properly, as it were, in inverted commas. Um, Maybe correcting some of the wrong notes, but even do a version where you transcribe and play the wrong notes. And this opens up like questions of sort of impulse and what's the word, like, improvisatory creativity as well, because
Mhm.
that's another element that
Oh
you could
yeah,
throw in there, you know.
yeah,
And how
indeed.
it's mediated through technology, and people could listen to those and think, oh, I like this tune, but the recording is so muffled and so bad you can't hear what's going on. I wish I could hear this higher fidelity. But then for me, as someone who made that in the first place, I'm like, actually, this captures what I experienced. But then
Mhm.
you can never have a direct experiential relationship necessarily, because what the artist, not referring to, this is an amateur project, not referring to myself as an artist, but what any artist creates at the point that they make it is not necessarily what's being received or the way it's being received by an audience or any member of any audience.
Mhm.
So yeah, I'll stop there before we get into hermeneutics.
No, it's fascinating. I think we could like speak for a long time about this aspect, and I also appreciate this rawness in some recordings. It depends on so many factors, on the context, on like literally what you want to even tell through this, right? And this is like this layer of, I know, perfection or imperfection of the mix and master. So just it depends on the what you want to achieve with this, right? And it's up to you as an artist and as a creator. I don't mind also this lo-fi recording as well, and I find it also fascinating. And because like we are living in very complex times in terms of like impacts of technology and how even being a musician, an artist, um, relates to digital presence, right? With TikTok, streaming algorithms, and even AI generated music in real time, it feels like distribution now often comes before creation, and music as a snapshot, not a finished project. So, do you think we are moving away from recordings as like fixed objects and towards something more fluid, interactive, even
Hmm.
co-created with audiences and machines? And what does that do to the purpose or even the meaning of a recording today?
Yeah, I mean, in a sense, you could think of it that there is a sort of I don't know what the right word is, like a I might be inventing a word, like a mediatization, of sound and music. I mean, this has always been the case to some extent. When a composer, 200 years ago was, or even 500 years ago, even in a religious context or whatever it might be, when they're writing music, they know that it's got to be sort of performed and received by a certain audience. So there is always this exchange with audience. Even expanding the idea of recording, like we're talking about sound recording and technology, but also, notated music is also recording. No, it's not audio recording, but it's textual. It's written. So there's this sort of discrepancy, and it plays in a little bit to that kind of artificial or semi-artificial divide between the sort of idea of classical and popular, or elite and avant-garde versus popular and kitsch. But there's this difference between composing music for a particular thing or a particular reason or for a particular stage or for a particular audience, as opposed to creating music in your social environment for yourself and your friends or family or whatever else it might be. So the there are questions that I don't have, or I don't know if anyone has answers to, but what are the differences, or rather there are multiple answers to these questions. So what are the differences between sitting down and listening to a symphony orchestra playing a symphony by a particular composer in a concert hall, or what is the difference between sitting down and you just like playing a bit of guitar and singing a song with all your friends as a social act? So that's a long-winded preamble to basically saying, I wonder, I mean, there are good and bad, there's always positive and negatives, and no one really knows what the positive and negatives are going to be when the technology is developing so quickly. But maybe there's a sense at which, if there is a greater interaction between audience and creator in this sense, it could, and I'm thinking in maybe a bit of a utopian way here, bring music back to a mode of kind of social communication and co-creation, which is interesting. Yeah, could reintroduce that element of it. It's not the same as it being something just, like I say, sitting around and playing music with friends. And I think some people often get very scared about the idea that it's going to replace, one's going to replace the other. But I would say the idea that like AI generated music or whatever else it might be might replace live performance, or might replace composers, or whatever you want to call them, or artists creating their own sort of human content, I think the lessons from history, in a sense, looking at how there were some similar debates about the I suppose the ethics, but also the kind of aesthetics of early recording and playback technologies. It didn't replace any of that. The wax cylinder, the shellac disc, whatever else that came afterwards, has never replaced live music and music making. It's
Mm-hmm.
just added a different dimension, a different layer to the way we experience it. So, in the positive sense, you could say the same thing about AI, I think, and the way that future technologies develop. They mediate our experience with sound in different ways, or they have the potential to do that, but it doesn't mean that they completely usurp or change something else. Like, people still go to the theatre, even though people go to the cinema. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, yeah,
They become slightly different experiences, yeah, in their own right, I think.
indeed. And so, how should we think about historical archives of music when AI models are trained on massive and sometimes untraceable audio data sets? So, is there a danger of erasing the context, or is it a new kind of
Hmm.
remix culture, maybe? What do you think?
It's Yeah, I mean, the idea of erasing the context, I think, is interesting because there's a certain context that is suggested by materiality. I mean, in a sense that, for example, with the early recordings, you can digitize them. You can take a photograph of their sleeve or whatever, and you can put that online. But it's like the difference between viewing an image online and hearing a digitization. I think maybe it's similar, but the difference between actually holding an object. There's a tactile element to it,
Hmm.
which helps contextualize it. I mean, even the fact that part of its essential context, like it's like actual nature of its existence, is that it is a physical object. Digitizing it is a great way of preserving and protecting the heritage so that it never gets lost. Because eventually these things end up degrading, or they end up getting destroyed, or if a lot of them are very fragile, and if they accidentally get dropped, then they shatter into a million pieces, and you can never replace them. I think that, to me, there has to be some sort of element of synthesis between the use of digital technologies to archive stuff and the material. So if we can achieve some kind of marriage between those things, and that's a good situation, in my opinion. Um, I mean, like my dad is a man who has grown up with like vinyl and all sorts, and has very much been like, oh no, we just digitize everything. It's the same thing with like film cameras. He's like, just digitize all the old films, and you can get rid of all this stuff. You don't need to have all these like records and CDs and stuff that are clogging up your space. Just get rid of it. It's all digitized. It's brilliant. It's all just there. So there are different, and these are generational attitudes that change. I'm the opposite. I'm like, no, keep all of the old material things. Keep the old dusty, like,
Mm,
photo books and all this kind of stuff. And I'm sure that it's not just generational, but it's also dependent on each individual, and
mhm,
what they value, really. So in my perfect world, there'd be some kind of synthesis between digitization and but also retaining a material object at the
mhm.
same time.
Yeah, yeah.
If that
Uh,
makes sense.
Especially, for example, in a context of vinyl collection. Now it's like from for some time already. It's like the renaissance of
Yeah,
vinyl, and there are
yeah,
many people
yeah.
who collect them in this way. Like
Yeah,
so.
absolutely. And there's a range of people who do that, from people who are like real audiophiles who really, really love this. I've got a really good friend of mine. He's got thousands of records. He's been collecting records for like 10 years, 15 years or something. He's
Mm,
got thousands of them. Including like new releases, it's everything, new releases, old releases, whatever it might be. And that's a real like specialist collector, you know, well, I don't know if it's even counts as a hobby, obsession, you would call it maybe.
oh,
Um,
like it's.
but
I think
and
it's
then there's
often it's a
yeah,
case.
exactly, yeah. And then there's also people who collect them because they like, they might not have a large record collection, but maybe it goes back to the idea that we said of the record as a sort of reclaiming a past
Mm,
experience in terms of getting the record out of the sleeve, putting it on, putting the arm on,
mm,
and actually like hearing it, having that as a process of sitting down and
mm,
having the artwork. I think some people value that as a way of sort of retreating a bit and slowing down a bit from having everything at your fingertips. There's a good book um, by a American musicologist called Peter Schmelz called Sonic Overload, and he's using that to talk about. He's talking about polystylism and Silvestrov and
mm,
Schnitker and
mm,
these composers in the 1970s and 80s and 90s. But I like the term sonic overload because it's the idea of more so than ever now as well. We have this sense of. I mean, referring to the post-war period where there was a lot of, collage, postmodernism, and this sort of mixing together of Schnitker called polystylism, and all the sounds of everything all at once crammed
mm,
together. Schmelz's idea is that this is almost polystylism is a reaction to this like globalism and connectivity and hearing all different sounds. And surely we've reached an even further point of that now than we ever have before. We've you can just go online and find
mm,
any sound, any piece of music, anything that you want. Retreating a bit from that, taking a step back and saying, I just want to listen to a record and get this
mhm.
physical thing out of its sleeve and put it on the thing, and it takes time to do that.
Yeah.
And you sit down, it gives you a bit of respite from the sonic overload, maybe.
Yeah,
Or
actually, I have to admit that when I used to study at music academy, I had a like fascination period on Schnittke's music. I really, I really appreciated his distance even to creation. Right, he was very also like I would say you can see the purpose and the intellect in his scores
yeah,
how
yeah,
he shaped
definitely.
yeah
Yeah,
his music and also like what you said about sonic overload. I think I would compare it like to even having some ritual listening to music, like with the tea, right? You can have a very quick
yeah.
tea from the bag, or you could really dive into the experience, like you.
I'm just laughing because before you said that, when I was talking about taking a step back, I was thinking in my head like tea.
Oh, really? Oh,
Yeah,
but that
yeah,
was that was my first thought because yeah, I
yeah,
really like also this moment of celebration of mm, preparing this tea
yeah,
from the
definitely.
pots and even smelling leaves and like have this
Yeah,
moment of dive into this experience and focus on
yeah.
this. Mm,
And if you think of it even as the sort of food or drink metaphor, when you're eating or you're drinking, you are consuming literally. You're consuming the food or the drink. But the idea of consumption, people use it, obviously in terms of music consumption and how you
mm,
consume music. I suppose almost in a kind of economic sense, how you buy it, how you experience it, the context for that. So people, maybe I like that kind of comparison because it does slow you down. It's like the idea of comparing it to say fast food, for example, or something that comes quick, which has its own value and has its own situation. But then sometimes you can't have that the whole time. You want to sit down and you want to make something from scratch and you want to slow it down, and it reconnects you. I think there's a feeling that people maybe get a bit scared, or I say people, I'm probably just talking about myself, but maybe other people feel the same, that you get scared about sort of losing your connection or your kind of gravity, your grounding in physical reality a bit.
Yeah.
You sort of when you have so much, it can almost be troubling the amount of stuff you can access, all at once at the same time. I mean, the other day, because I've been working a lot recently, doing tons of these, things like funding applications, a lot of teaching and
Mhm.
marking and this kind of stuff, and then that all finished sort of last week, and I met up with a friend, and he was like, "So what have you been up to then since you finished?" I was like, "Well, the other day I actually sat down and listened to some music." you know, so it was, as opposed to like having it on in the background whilst I'm doing something else, or having it on
Mhm.
if I'm researching something, be like, "Oh, how does this piece go?" Or, "What's this recording like?" Hearing bits and pieces, having it in the background. But I was like, I actually sat down and listened to music, and I wasn't doing anything else at the same time. And that was a really like grounding experience in that way.
Mm.
Going back to older technologies, it helps you reclaim this kind of past that you've never been to, perhaps for
Mhm.
certain generations. But it also helps you slow down and get that grounding, and it returns it to the focus on the music, maybe like preparing the tea and being able to smell the leaves and whatever.
Yeah.
It's no longer just about the caffeine content because you got to get to work. It's about like the experience and the flavor and everything that goes
Mhm.
with it.
Indeed. So, like, even thinking about nowadays times and when algorithms serve as music, like tailored to our moods, location, right? Or even biometrics. So,
Yeah.
uh, who's really curating the experience? What do you think? Because are we still choosing music, or is
Mm.
music choosing us?
Yeah, that's really interesting. And it depends. It depends on what level you want to go with it. So I used to work. I used to work in a music shop,
Mhm.
and we used to be in the back room and do all the orders and that. And it was like not the best job in the world. But one thing that we used to do was just because YouTube at that time, was when it started having its recommended algorithms, like what's the next track, what's the next thing. So we used to start by putting on something that we both liked or one of us thought was good, listen to it, and then gradually went into the rule of saying, right, now always just go for whatever's recommended and just don't think about it, don't look it up first, just go for the first thing that just, what's the title or what's the image that goes with it, what does it think that you will like based on what you've heard before. And so it's a kind of interesting experiment because sometimes it throws up stuff that's just like, this is awful, this has got nothing to do with what I like. And then other times it's like quite a good kind of discovery process. You go, actually, I'm really into this and I would never have heard about it for any other way. You're using that sort of generative algorithm that's responding to stuff you listen to as a sort of discovery tool. But then it's a little bit like anything, you can eventually go through so many of those processes that you end up with something that you think it's got nothing to do with what you were ever listening to. It sort of gets a bit confused and recommends you something that you're like, no, you've you've misunderstood. So yeah, and obviously with Spotify and things like that, there are these. It sort of takes what you've been listening to and says, here's a recommended mix for you. But it
Mhm.
doesn't necessarily know or understand. It's the term tribalism is often used. It's not a great term, but the idea of like you have your own genre, or even within a genre, that within subgenres you have your own bands, and there are like band rivalries and things like that. So you could be listening to metal or any type of metal. You could be listening to a specific subgenre or something like that. But then an algorithm doesn't really understand the human community
Mhm.
aspect of like, no, I don't listen to that band because it was founded by the ex band member of this band that I love who broke that band up. So it goes,
Mhm.
here's a great mix for you, and it might contain bands that you really hate for personal reasons, but
Indeed.
stylistically, all of the little tags, like what
Mm.
genre tags they have, kind of fit. Yeah, I mean, your question is, is are we choosing the music or is it sort of choosing us, or the algorithms choosing it for us?
Mhm.
And I think that again, maybe it's a little bit like the synthesis I was saying with the idea of the archives. I think you can use those algorithms as a tool for exploration. For me personally, I don't like them as a substitute for my own kind of curation of music, if that makes sense.
Mhm.
Um, I have this thing that I've been doing that's this is a weird. Oh, well, maybe it's not weird. I don't know if other people do this, but I keep track records. It's like kind of making playlists or mixtapes, right? I've been doing this since 2011, and I call it song of the day. It doesn't have to be a song every single day. Uh, you know, uh, each volume I keep has 20 tracks in it, right? Usually
Mhm.
takes me about 2 months, 2 or 3 months to fill up 20 tracks. Then I save that. That's volume one. Next volume, and I date when they are. So The only
Oh wow.
rules are it has to be for a song of the day is it has to be a song that's it's in your head, something that you've heard before that you really like and you can't get out of your head, and you're like, I'm really enjoying this tune right now. Could be something that you just heard on the radio or you heard through a Spotify playlist or some algorithm suggested to you, and you go, oh, I really click with that. I love that. The only rule is that you can't duplicate from a
Mm.
previous volume, right? So
That's a
in
challenge.
that's a weird form of like self archivization,
Hmm.
because it documents everything I was listening to and when I found out about these songs. It's been going for a long time, and it's just something that I find compulsive. I don't even go back and look through the lists that often, but when I do, it's interesting. I rediscover things that I didn't remember that I put in there, and it's a weird thing because that form of like self archivizing stuff that I've listened to, it is technologically mediated because some of the stuff I found they've been inspired by old technologies like radio, for example. I've heard stuff on the radio and been like, I like that song, look it up. Also by things like you say, like these algorithms that suggest things, or like random things that
Mm.
seem random things that come on after that's been suggested digitally, or whatever else it might be. So they've introduced me to music in that sense. But then I've documented it digitally on a Word document and sort of saved that in a digital space, which I back up on a cloud. So it's like it's still floating around. So yeah, there's an interesting sort of sense of I don't know how to quite self-analyze it, but in terms of how people have a relationship with music, the idea of curating music is a really, really interesting one. For me, it's important to like curate in my own way, like
Mm.
this idea. So now I've got like 50, 60 volumes of 20 tracks each that are like playlists, or they're like playlists that represent what I was listening to in those 3 months at that particular time in my life. But so that's a curation in that sense, but they have also been generated by multiple sources, including me discovering music through algorithms that I wouldn't have done otherwise, for example.
Oh yeah, it's very helpful for discovering, but it's as you said, I can relate to this. That sometimes because I use, of course, the Spotify and their suggestions to discover weekly or like new releases, and
Mm.
they are also dedicated playlists, and sometimes because I like various things and I like various genres from like even classical through jazz and electronic music and like many different pop as well. Like I try to
Mm.
stay up to date with what is going on as well, and because I like different genres through different for different reasons, and sometimes
Yeah.
even this algorithm it like usually I'm disappointed to be honest with
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
selection.
But I think that's the interesting thing, isn't it? Because that's why this kind of this idea of that, how to put it, like if you're making a playlist, or it goes back to the earlier idea of making a mixtape, for example. Maybe I'm making too much of a historical leap here, but even the sense that like concert programming, perhaps, people put certain pieces together in a concert program because they might have some sort of link between them, and they work well together. And then there's the idea of like making mixtapes and things like that. But there's, and then also the idea of playlists. But these are all things that the reason why they're sort of special in a way. I mean, is quite vague to say special like that, but they convey meaning because they've been created by somebody thinking about what maybe an unusual link between something is that goes beyond a sort of genre tag or something like that.
Mm.
So it's not like someone going to you, oh, I know you like this type of music, so here's a playlist of like random bands that I've heard of who are in this genre. Here you go. Which you'd be like, okay, fine, but it's not. It doesn't really. It's not quite the same thing as someone saying, well, here's an actual curated mixtape that's based around the theme of X, Y, and Z. And it might not necessarily be just about what the lyrics are, or
Mm.
whatever else, but it might be something to do with personal experience. Like I've experienced, when we first met, we first became friends. This was the tune that we were talking about. Do you know what I mean? Like an
Yeah,
algorithm can't produce that connection for you with
indeed.
in a human sense.
Yeah, 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 I totally agree. It's also like there are different factors, and it's not only music itself, but also how you like the context, right? And many
Mm.
different things that also have an impact on your choices in music.
Yeah, definitely.
Mm. So I have last question for you. Now, music can evolve continuously, like reedited, remixed, retrained by AI. Is permanence still add value in music, or are we in an age of infinite variation?
That's a massive question. Oh man, yeah, I don't know where to start. It's good. It's a good question. I think there is a sense that I mean, I can take maybe I could even start by taking it back once again to early recordings, because the idea that there's a freezing of time, or rather a fixing of something that's perfect, it goes back, or maybe does it go back or does it come forwards? It comes forwards in one sense. In terms of recording technologies, I think it's a more recent phenomenon. The idea that we have this a recording of a piece of music that's the definitive recording. But obviously, it's an older concept, because it also, you can go back to talking about notation and editions, and creating editions. This edition represents the true, faithful last word of the composer. This is what the composer wanted. Kenneth Hamilton has done a lot of work. He's a scholar and performer who's done a lot of work on Liszt and Liszt editions, for example, because how can you say that this one version of this piece represents the composer's definitive idea for a composer like Liszt, who composed and recomposed and revised, and there's like 4 different versions of a certain piece of music. So how do you claim definitiveness, or even authenticity, if we go back to that term? These things are all kind of relate in a circle around one to another. So in a historical sense, I think you could say, like with the early recordings, they do represent a particular moment. They're like sonic information that's kind of locked into a physical medium, and they can tell you a lot about the people who recorded those pieces at that time, and who they marketed them to, why they did that, why they did it in that way, how they were distributed, and things like that. If you're treating them as a source material, then there's an element at which that freezing in time is definitely a reality, and it's a value as well.
Mm.
But I think it would be a mistake to say that this freezing in time represents to borrow the term from editing, the urtext. So then everything that comes after has to have fidelity to this particular recording, and if it doesn't, then it's inauthentic. Yeah, because music, I think, has always been fluid. It's been fluid in terms of how people interpret, how people want to express things. That's why you have, not only in classical music, where you have different artists playing the same piece of music a million times. Like, do we need another recording of a Beethoven piano sonata? Like, there are so many of them. But the answer is like yes, because it's still interesting, because people experience them in different ways. The same can be said of just even before recording of performance practices. The same can be said of like popular music, the amount of covers that you have. Do we need another version of this particular song? How many? For example, in some teaching I've done recently, I've included we've been looking at I Put a Spell on You. How it's like it was first recorded by Screaming Jay, then it was recorded by Nina Simone, and just 10 years difference between those 2 records, 2 different artists in the same context, completely different the way you can interpret the tune and what it might mean. So yeah, I think that there has always been a fluidity, and I think that there always will be, and I think that maybe I don't see that the future development of technology, it won't necessarily either fix or open this kind of concept, but it might be useful as a tool to help us, like I was saying earlier, re-engage with this idea of interaction, maybe, and sort of like co-creativity, between kind of consumer and performer, perhaps. But that's an optimistic view. I hope that we can do something positive, use it as a tool, if you like,
Oh,
as
yeah.
opposed to something that's this evil thing that's going to destroy music as we know it today, which is not, I don't think. But
Yeah, it depends how we will use this technology. I also think so, because
yeah.
it's up to us as humanity, generally
Yeah,
speaking.
and there'll still be that human input. It's still
Oh
a
yeah.
human process, a human creative process.
Hmm.
So yeah,
Okay, Richard, thank you so much. It was
right.
a very fascinating and inspiring talk. Can we find you somewhere in the internet? Do you have your website or some
At the
place?
moment,
Hmm.
I because I'm in between working in different institutions and so on. I sometimes have a institutional academic page, and sometimes I don't. So, but I will eventually be uploading some of my, these piano pieces I've been recording in bits and pieces. When I've got a little bit more time to breathe, I will be putting up some bits and pieces of music here and there. So you might see me cropping up somewhere.
Okay. Okay, so thank you once again.
Yeah, thanks so much. It's been great. I've really enjoyed this. Thank you.